The silence was maddening for Katherine Wells, like a physical weight pressing on her lungs with each breath she took in the sprawling farmhouse that once bustled with life. For months had passed since the influenza had taken both her parents, leaving her alone with nothing but memories echoing through empty rooms on the outskirts of Riverend, Colorado, in the spring of 1878. Katherine stood at the kitchen window, her hands plunged in soapy water as she washed a single plate, a single cup, and a single spoon. The monotonous task took less than a minute, leaving her with another endless day stretching before her. At 24, she had become a ghost in her own home, haunting rooms that no longer needed dusting for visitors who never came. The distant sound of hoofbeats stirred her from her thoughts. Katherine wiped her hands on her apron and moved to the front door, squinting against the bright sunlight that flooded the porch. A wagon approached, kicking up dust from the dry road leading to her property. She rarely received visitors since her parents' passing, and her heart quickened at the prospect of human interaction. As the wagon drew closer, she could make out a man at the reins with what appeared to be children, 3 of them bouncing beside him on the wooden seat. Katherine smoothed her simple blue dress and tucked a stray strand of chestnut hair behind her ear, suddenly conscious of her appearance. The wagon came to a halt in front of her house, and the man, tall with broad shoulders and a weathered face partially hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat, set the brake and jumped down with the easy grace of someone accustomed to physical labor. The children remained seated, though their curious eyes were fixed on Katherine. "Miss Wells?" the man called, approaching the porch steps. He removed his hat, revealing sun-lightened brown hair that curled slightly at the ends. "Yes," Katherine replied, her voice hoarse from disuse. "Elijah Morgan," he introduced himself with a slight bow of his head. "I've purchased the old Henderson place next door. Sheriff Donovan mentioned you might be willing to sell some of your extra furniture. I'm afraid we've arrived with precious little to our name." Katherine studied the man before her. He was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 30, with kind eyes the color of a summer storm and a day's worth of stubble on his jawline. His clothes were worn but clean, speaking of a man who took pride in himself despite limited means. "I wasn't aware the Henderson place had sold," Katherine said, realizing how isolated she'd become. The neighboring ranch had been empty for nearly 2 years. "Just finalized last week," Elijah said. "We've been camping in the house for 3 days now." He glanced back at the wagon where the children had begun to fidget. "These are my little ones. Come say hello, children." 3 pairs of feet hit the ground almost simultaneously as the children scrambled from the wagon. The oldest, a boy of about 10 with his father's eyes and a serious expression, approached first. A girl of perhaps 8 followed, clutching the hand of a smaller boy who couldn't have been more than 5. "This is Edward," Elijah said, placing a hand on the oldest boy's shoulder. "My daughter Lucy, and the little one is James." Edward gave a proper bow that made Katherine smile for the first time in months. "Pleased to meet you, madam," he said in a voice that suggested he'd been coached on proper manners. "We don't have any beds," little James announced with the blunt honesty of a child. "I've been sleeping on Papa's coat." Elijah's cheeks colored slightly. "James, that's not. I have furniture," Katherine interrupted, finding herself charmed by the child's candor. "More than I need for just myself. Please come inside." As the Morgan family followed her into the house, Katherine became acutely aware of how the space transformed around them. Footsteps echoed on wooden floors that had known only her solitary tread for months. Small gasps and whispers filled rooms that had been silent for too long. "You have so many books," Lucy exclaimed, her eyes wide as they passed the small library that had been Katherine's father's pride. "And a piano," Edward added, pointing to the instrument in the corner of the parlor that Katherine hadn't touched since her mother's passing. "Can you play?" Katherine asked him. Edward shook his head. "Mama could," he said simply, and the light in his eyes dimmed just enough for Katherine to understand. Elijah placed a gentle hand on his son's shoulder. Their mother passed 2 winters ago, he explained quietly. Childbirth fever. I'm so sorry, Katherine said, the words inadequate but sincere. I lost my parents to influenza this past winter. A moment of understanding passed between them, the knowledge that they both knew what it meant to continue breathing when loved ones no longer could. James broke the somber moment by tugging on Katherine's skirt. Your house is too quiet, he declared with a child's unfiltered observation. Our house is always noisy. Papa says sometimes he'd like 5 minutes of peace, but I don't think he really means it. Elijah laughed, a rich sound that seemed to bring warmth to the cool interior of the house. James has my number, I'm afraid. Between Edward's whittling, Lucy's singing, and James's constant questions, there's hardly a silent moment. I'll fill it with noise, James promised Katherine solemnly. If you want. Something shifted in Katherine's chest at the child's innocent offer, a loosening of the tight band that had been constricting her heart for months. I think I'd like that very much, she replied, surprised to find her eyes misting. Elijah studied her face for a moment, then cleared his throat. Well, we shouldn't impose on Miss Wells's hospitality any longer than necessary. Perhaps we could discuss what furniture you might be willing to part with. They spent the next hour walking through the house, Katherine pointing out pieces she could spare her parents' bed, a dresser, a small table with chairs, and various household items that had been collecting dust. When Elijah inquired about price, Katherine found herself reluctant to name one. To be honest, Mr. Morgan, having these things gone would be doing me a favor. The house feels... She paused, searching for the right word. Too full of memories? Elijah suggested gently. Katherine nodded, grateful for his understanding. But I can't possibly just give them to you. How about this? Elijah proposed, hat in hand. The children and I are planning to plant a vegetable garden behind our place. We could bring you fresh produce when the harvest comes in. And I can help you clean, Lucy offered eagerly. Mama taught me how to make beds proper before she went to heaven. I can chop wood, Edward added, standing taller. I'm strong for my age. Katherine looked at the eager faces before her and felt something she hadn't experienced in months' hope. The prospect of having these lively souls nearby suddenly seemed like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. I have a better idea, she said, making a decision that surprised even herself. Why don't you join me for dinner night? I've been cooking for one for so long, I've nearly forgotten how to make a proper meal. It would give me great pleasure to cook for your family. Elijah appeared momentarily taken aback by the invitation but recovered quickly. That's very kind, but we wouldn't want to impose. Please, Papa, Lucy pleaded. Miss Wells has a real dining table with chairs and everything. And I'm powerful hungry, James added, patting his stomach for emphasis. Elijah's resistance crumbled in the face of his children's enthusiasm. If you're certain it's no trouble? No trouble at all, Katherine assured him, realizing she meant it. The prospect of preparing a meal for others filled her with unexpected energy. Come back around 6. I'll have everything ready. After the Morgans departed with promises to return, Katherine found herself moving through the house with a purpose she hadn't felt in months. She opened windows, letting fresh spring air chase away the stale emptiness. She dusted surfaces that had been neglected and laid her mother's best tablecloth over the dining table. The kitchen came alive as she prepared a meal far more elaborate than her usual solitary fare: roast chicken with potatoes, fresh bread, green beans from her small garden, and an apple pie for dessert. The familiar routines of cooking, once performed mechanically, now brought her satisfaction as she imagined the delight on little James's face when he saw the pie. When the Morgans returned that evening, cleaner than they had been earlier and clearly dressed in their best clothes, Katherine's house transformed from a mausoleum of memories to a home once more. The children's exclamations, their footsteps, Even their occasional bickering filled the spaces that had been hollow for too long. During dinner, Katherine learned that Elijah had been a rancher in Kansas before his wife's death had upended their lives. He'd spent the past 2 years working odd jobs, saving enough to buy a small property where he could raise his children properly. "The Henderson place needs work," he admitted as they enjoyed their pie, "but the land is good. I've got plans for cattle, maybe some horses once we're established." "Papa's the best with horses," Edward said proudly. "Even the mean ones that nobody else can ride." "Is that so?" Katherine asked, watching Elijah's modest shrug with interest. "I have a way with them," he conceded. "Always have." As the evening drew to a close, Katherine found herself reluctant to see them leave. The house would be unbearably quiet once more without their presence. "Thank you for the finest meal we've had in months," Elijah said as they stood at her door. "We're in your debt." "Not at all," Katherine replied. Having company was payment enough. Little James tugged at her skirt again. "Can we come back tomorrow?" he asked hopefully. "I like it here. It's not scary like our house." "James," Elijah admonished gently, "we can't invite ourselves to Miss Wells's home." Katherine knelt to James's level. "Is your house scary?" He nodded solemnly. "It makes funny noises at night, and there's no lamps, just candles. And Edward says there might be ghosts, but Papa says that's nonsense." "I see," Katherine said thoughtfully. She stood and addressed Elijah. "Mr. Morgan, I have several oil lamps I no longer need. And as it happens, I've just discovered I've baked far too much bread for one person. Perhaps you and the children could stop by tomorrow after you finished your work? I could send the lamps and bread home with you." The relief in Elijah's eyes was evident. "That's very generous of you, Miss Wells." "Katherine," she corrected him. "Please call me Katherine." "Katherine," he repeated, the name sounding right in his deep voice. "Then I'm Elijah to you." That night, for the first time since her parents' deaths, Katherine fell asleep without the crushing weight of loneliness pressing on her chest. The prospect of tomorrow's visit gave her something to look forward to, a novel feeling after months of days blending meaninglessly into one another. What began as a simple neighborly gesture quickly evolved into a routine. The Morgans would come in the late afternoon, the children helping Katherine with various tasks while Elijah loaded furniture and household items onto his wagon to take to their home. After work was done, they would share a meal, during which Katherine found herself laughing more than she had in years. Within a week, the sound of the Morgans' wagon approaching had become her favorite sound. The children had begun calling her Miss Katie, and even Elijah had relaxed his formal demeanor, sharing stories of his ranching days and his dreams for their new property. It was during the second week of this arrangement that Katherine realized she was falling in love not just with Elijah, whose quiet strength and tender care for his children touched her deeply, but with the entire Morgan family. The way Edward's serious expression would break into a boyish grin when he managed to complete a difficult task. Lucy's honest attempts to be a little lady while still being unable to resist climbing the old oak tree in Katherine's yard. And James's constant chatter that filled every corner of her once silent home. On a warm evening in late May, as they sat on Katherine's porch watching the children chase fireflies in the yard, Elijah turned to her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I've been meaning to ask you something," he said, his voice lower than usual. "The children and we've taken up so much of your time these past weeks. I hope we haven't been a burden." "A burden?" Katherine's surprise was genuine. "Elijah, you and the children have brought life back to this house and to me. I was merely existing before you arrived. Now I feel like I'm living again." His eyes held hers for a moment longer than necessary. "I feel the same way," he admitted. "After Sarah died, I thought my heart had closed up shop for good. But being around you—" He trailed off, seemingly unsure how to continue. Katherine's pulse quickened as she waited for him to find his words. "The thing is," Elijah continued, The Henderson place is starting to look like a proper home thanks to your generosity. But the children keep asking when we're coming back here each day. Especially James, he told me yesterday. He wishes we could just stay here forever. Katherine felt a flutter in her stomach. And what did you tell him? I told him that's not how things work. That we can't just move into someone else's home, because we like it there. Elijah ran a hand through his hair, a nervous gesture she'd come to recognize. But then I got to thinking. Maybe there's another way. Before he could continue, a screech from the yard interrupted them. Lucy had fallen while chasing her brothers, and both men immediately rushed to her side. The moment was lost as they tended to the girl's scraped knee, but Katherine couldn't help wondering what Elijah had been about to say. The answer came 3 days later. Katherine had spent the morning helping Elijah and the children plant their vegetable garden, returning to her own home only when the midday sun became too intense. She was preparing a cold lunch when she heard the now familiar sound of Elijah's boots on her porch. He stood at her door, hat in hand, looking uncharacteristically nervous. "Katherine, might I have a word with you? Alone." "Of course." She wiped her hands on her apron and followed him to the porch, curiosity piqued by his serious tone. "Is everything all right? Where are the children?" "They're fine. Edward's watching his siblings back at our place." Elijah paced the length of the porch before stopping directly in front of her. "I'm not a man who's good with fancy words, Katherine. I speak plain, and I live plain. But what I feel for you isn't plain at all." Katherine's heart began to race as she realized where the conversation was heading. "In just these few weeks, you've become essential to us," Elijah continued. "The children adore you and he paused, gathering courage. "I find myself thinking about you from sunup to sundown. Your smile, your kindness, the way you've opened your heart to my children." He took a step closer. "I know it's fast, maybe too fast. And I know I'm not offering much. A widower with 3 children and a rundown ranch isn't exactly a prize. But I'm a hard worker, and I promise you'd never want for anything I could provide." "Elijah," Katherine whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "What exactly are you asking?" "I'm asking if you might consider becoming my wife," he said, his eyes never leaving hers. "If you might consider letting me fill this house with noise and laughter for good, instead of just a few hours each day." Tears sprang to Katherine's eyes, but before she could respond, the sound of running feet and childish voices broke the moment. The Morgan children appeared around the corner of the house, Edward clearly having failed in his duty to keep his siblings occupied.
"Papa,"
James called out, racing up the porch steps. "Did you ask her? Is Miss Katie going to be our new mama?" Lucy gasped, scandalized. "James, Papa said we were supposed to wait until he came back." Edward, trailing behind his siblings with a resigned expression, simply shrugged at his father's exasperated look. "They got away from me." Katherine couldn't help but laugh through her tears at the scene before her, this imperfect, wonderful family that had crashed into her life and changed everything. Elijah knelt down to address his children. "I was just in the middle of asking Miss Katherine a very important question, which she hasn't had a chance to answer yet." 3 pairs of eyes turned expectantly toward Katherine, their expressions a mixture of hope and anxiety that mirrored their father's. In that moment, Katherine knew with absolute certainty what her answer would be. The loneliness that had nearly crushed her spirit had been banished by this man and his children. They had brought noise and chaos and joy back into her empty house, transforming it once again into a home. "Yes," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. "Yes, I would very much like to be your wife, Elijah Morgan." The children erupted in cheers, James launching himself at Katherine's skirts while Lucy danced in circles on the porch. Even Edward's serious face split into a wide grin as he accepted his father's one-armed hug. Elijah stood and approached Katherine, his eyes never leaving hers as he took her hands in his. "Are you certain?" he asked softly, so only she could hear. I don't want you agreeing because of the children's expectations. I'm saying yes because I love you, Katherine replied simply. I love all of you, and I can't imagine my life without the noise and joy you've brought into it. Elijah's smile was radiant as he bent to kiss her cheek, mindful of the children watching with delighted expressions. I promise you won't regret it, he whispered against her skin. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of preparations. The town of Riverend buzzed with news of the upcoming wedding between the Wells girl and the new rancher. Some whispered that it was too soon after her parents' passing for Katherine to be thinking of marriage, but she paid the gossip no mind. She knew her parents would have approved of Elijah, his integrity, his work ethic, and most importantly, the way he looked at her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. Elijah and the children continued to work on the Henderson place, though it was understood that after the wedding, they would all live in Katherine's larger, more comfortable house. Each evening, when they gathered around her table for dinner, Katherine marveled at how completely her life had transformed in such a short time. The wedding took place on a perfect June morning, with wildflowers decorating the small church in town. Lucy served as Katherine's maid of honor, proudly walking ahead of the bride with a basket of rose petals she'd helped gather that morning. Edward stood tall beside his father, shoulders back and chin up as he took his role as best man with the utmost seriousness. James, tasked with carrying the rings, approached his duty with such concentration that several of the guests had to hide their smiles. Sheriff Donovan had given Katherine away, a kindness that had brought tears to her eyes when he'd offered. Your father was a good friend, he'd told her. He'd be happy to see you smiling again. As Katherine spoke her vows to Elijah, she felt the presence of those they had lost, her parents, his wife Sarah, surrounding them with silent blessings. This marriage wasn't about forgetting the past, but about building a future that honored those memories while creating new ones. The celebration afterward was modest but joyful, with the entire town turning out to wish the new family well. As the sun began to set, Katherine found herself sitting on a bench outside the church, watching as Elijah swung a giggling James high in the air. He's a good man, Mrs. Holloway, the preacher's wife, said as she settled beside Katherine. Those children needed a mother's love, and you needed that family to bring you back to life. The Lord works in mysterious ways. Katherine smiled, unable to disagree. I never imagined finding happiness again after losing my parents. I thought I'd be alone in that quiet house forever. And now I can't imagine it ever being quiet again, Katherine laughed. James alone makes enough noise for 3 children. Mrs. Holloway patted her hand. That's how you know a house has become a home, my dear, when it's filled with noise and love in equal measure. That night, after the children had finally succumbed to sleep in their new rooms, Katherine and Elijah stood in the doorway of their home now, truly and completely. Happy, Mrs. Morgan? Elijah asked, his arm around her waist. Happier than I ever thought possible, Katherine replied, leaning into his embrace. Though I'm a bit worried about what the children will think when they realize we're going to add even more noise to this house eventually. Elijah looked down at her, his expression questioning until understanding dawned in his eyes. Katherine, are you saying? She shook her head with a smile.
No, not yet.
But I hope someday. Would that be all right with you? His answer was a kiss that left her breathless, there on the porch of the house that had once been too quiet but would never be so again. The first year of their marriage passed in a blur of activity. Elijah's careful stewardship of both properties began to show results as his small herd of cattle grew and the crops flourished. Katherine found her days filled with the joyful chaos of motherhood, guiding Lucy through the intricacies of household management, helping Edward with his schoolwork, and answering James's endless questions about everything under the sun. There were challenges, of course. Edward struggled at times with accepting Katherine as a maternal figure, his memories of his birth mother still strong. There were nights when Katherine would find him sitting alone on the porch, looking up at the stars with an expression too solemn for a child his age. On one such night, Katherine quietly sat beside him, careful not to intrude on his private thoughts. They sat in companionable silence for several minutes before Edward spoke. "Do you think my mama can see us from heaven?" he asked, his voice small. "I believe she can," Katherine answered honestly. "And I think she's very proud of the young man you're becoming." Edward considered this. "Does it make you sad when I talk about her?" Katherine turned to look at the boy, so perceptive, so concerned about others' feelings despite his youth. "No, Edward. Your mother will always be a part of you, and I would never want to change that. She gave you life and loved you first. I'm just grateful I get to love you now." "Pa says you saved us," Edward confided. "He told me once that after Mama died, he was just going through the motions of living until we met you." Katherine's heart swelled at the boy's words. "The truth is, Edward, you all saved me too. This house was so quiet after my parents died. I was just existing, not really living. Your father and you children changed everything." Edward leaned against her shoulder then, a rare display of affection from the usually reserved boy. "I'm glad we're a family," he said simply. "So am I," Katherine replied, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. Such moments of connection grew more frequent as the seasons changed. By their first Christmas as a family, the transition felt nearly complete. The house that had once echoed with Katherine's solitary footsteps now rang with the sounds of family life. Lucy practicing at the piano Katherine had taught her to play, Edward's careful hammering as he worked on wooden toys for his siblings, James's endless chatter, and Elijah's deep laugh that never failed to warm Katherine's heart. In the spring of their second year of marriage, Katherine's earlier prediction came true. She was with child. The news was met with mixed reactions from the children. Lucy was ecstatic at the prospect of a baby to help care for. Edward was cautiously optimistic, and James was concerned primarily with whether the baby would take his place as the youngest. "You'll always be special, James," Katherine assured him as she tucked him into bed one night. "Being a big brother is a very important job." "Will the baby be noisy?" James asked, his expression serious. "Very noisy," Katherine confirmed. "Babies cry a lot, especially at night." James considered this information. "Good," he declared finally. "Because you said you wanted a noisy house, remember? When we first met you." Katherine smiled at the child's memory. "I did say that, didn't I? And you promised to fill it with noise." "I kept my promise," James said proudly. "You certainly did," Katherine agreed, kissing his forehead. "And it was the best promise anyone ever made to me." As her pregnancy progressed, Elijah became increasingly protective, insisting on hiring help for the household chores despite Katherine's protests that she was perfectly capable of continuing her duties. "I almost lost Sarah to childbirth," he confessed one night as they lay in bed, his hand resting protectively over her growing belly. "I couldn't bear to lose you two, Katherine." The children couldn't bear it. She covered his hand with her own. "I'm strong and healthy, and Dr. Reynolds says everything is progressing normally. You won't lose me, Elijah." "I'm holding you to that promise," he said, pressing a kiss to her temple. In the late fall, as the first snow of the season dusted the Colorado landscape, Katherine gave birth to a healthy baby girl they named Grace. The labor had been difficult but manageable, and the sight of Elijah's tears as he held his daughter for the first time had made every moment of discomfort worthwhile. The children were fascinated by their tiny sister. Edward approached her with careful reverence. Lucy immediately appointed herself assistant nursemaid, and James spent hours simply watching the baby sleep, occasionally poking her gently to make sure she was still alive. "She doesn't make much noise for a baby," he observed with disappointment after the first week. "Just wait," Elijah told him with a knowing smile. "She's just getting started." As if on cue, baby Grace began to wail, a surprisingly powerful sound from such a tiny body. James's eyes widened with delight. "See," Katherine laughed as she lifted the crying infant. She's doing her part to keep our house noisy. Life settled into a new rhythm with Grace's arrival. The older children took on more responsibilities, eager to help care for their sister and prove their maturity. Elijah's cattle ranch flourished, allowing him to hire additional hands and expand their operations. Katherine, once she had recovered from childbirth, found joy in managing their growing household and watching her family thrive. By the time Grace celebrated her first birthday, the house that had once been too quiet for Katherine to bear had become the center of a bustling, loving family. The pain of her parents' loss had not disappeared, but it had transformed into something softer, something she could carry alongside the joy of her present life. On a warm summer evening, as the family gathered on the porch after dinner, Katherine watched her children playing in the yard. Edward, now 12 and growing tall, helping 5-year-old Grace chase fireflies while Lucy and James argued good-naturedly about whose turn it was to fetch water from the well in the morning. Elijah slipped his arm around her waist, pulling her close. "Penny for your thoughts, Mrs. Morgan?" "I was just thinking about how much has changed," Katherine replied, leaning into his embrace. 5 years ago, I was alone in this house, convinced I'd never feel happiness again. Now look at us. Elijah followed her gaze to their children. "Best decision I ever made was buying that rundown Henderson place."
Who would have thought it would lead me to you?
"I think your exact words were, 'I'll fill it with noise,'" Katherine reminded him with a smile. "Or rather, James said that. And we've certainly delivered on that promise." Elijah chuckled as James let out a whoop of victory in whatever game he and Lucy had transitioned to. "I wouldn't have it any other way," Katherine said softly. As if sensing he was being discussed, James bounded up the porch steps, his face flushed with excitement. "Mama, Papa, Lucy says I can't have a dog, but I think we need one. A big one that barks real loud." To add to the noise, Elijah asked with a knowing glance at Katherine. "Exactly," James exclaimed. "Our house should be the noisiest one in all of Colorado Territory." Katherine laughed, the sound mingling with the evening breeze and the distant calls of the other children. "I think we're well on our way to that distinction already, but we can discuss a dog at breakfast." Satisfied with this answer, James raced back to join his siblings, leaving Elijah and Katherine alone once more. "You know he won't forget," Elijah warned. "He'll be asking about that dog the moment he opens his eyes tomorrow." "I'm counting on it," Katherine replied. "A house isn't a home without a little chaos, after all." Elijah turned to face her, his expression suddenly serious. "Do you ever regret it? Taking on a widower with 3 children? Our life isn't exactly peaceful." Katherine reached up to touch his face, her heart full of the love they had built together. "Not for a single moment. Peace is overrated, Elijah Morgan. I'll take your noise and chaos over silence any day." As the sun set over their thriving ranch, casting long shadows across the land they had nurtured together, Elijah leaned down to kiss his wife, a kiss that spoke of promises kept and a future still unfolding before them. And in the background, the joyful sounds of their children's laughter filled the once too quiet house, a symphony more beautiful to Katherine than any silence could ever be. 2 years later, the Morgan family had grown yet again. Katherine had given birth to twins, a boy they named William and a girl they called Elizabeth, bringing their total to 6 children. The house that had once echoed with emptiness now barely contained the energy of their expanding family. On a crisp autumn morning, Katherine stood at the kitchen window, watching as Elijah taught Edward and James how to repair the fence that enclosed their vegetable garden. At 17, Edward had grown into a thoughtful young man who mirrored his father's steady nature. James, at 12, retained his exuberance, but had developed a genuine talent for working with the horses his father raised. Lucy, now 15, had become Katherine's right hand in managing the household and caring for her younger siblings. She moved gracefully around the kitchen, kneading bread dough while keeping an eye on 3-year-old Grace, who was helping by arranging spoons on the table in various patterns. The twins, just beginning to toddle with confidence, were napping upstairs after a morning of determined exploration that had left Katherine both exhausted and amused. "Mama," Lucy said, breaking into Katherine's thoughts, "do you think I might wear your blue dress to the harvest dance next month? Sarah Donovan mentioned that Robert Fletcher might ask me to dance, and blue is his favorite color." Katherine turned from the window with a smile. "I think that could be arranged. We'll need to take it in a bit. I was a few years older than you when I had that dress made." Lucy's face lit up. "Thank you. I promise I'll be extra careful with it." The sound of horses approaching drew their attention. Katherine moved to the door, wiping her hands on her apron as Elijah and the boys came to meet the visitor. It was Sheriff Donovan, looking older than his years, but still sitting tall in his saddle. He tipped his hat to Katherine as she stepped onto the porch. "Morning, Mrs. Morgan. Got some news I thought Elijah would want to hear right away." "Come inside, Sheriff," Katherine invited. "Lucy's just about to take the morning bread out of the oven." The sheriff dismounted, tying his horse to the hitching post before following the family into the house. The kitchen table, large enough to accommodate their growing family, quickly became the center of attention as Lucy served coffee to the adults and milk to the children. "What brings you out this way, John?" Elijah asked once everyone was settled. Sheriff Donovan took a sip of his coffee before answering. "Railroad's coming through, Elijah. They've settled on a route that'll pass just north of town, and they're looking to buy up cattle to feed the workers. Could be a good opportunity for you." Elijah's eyes lit up at the news. "That would save us the cattle drive to Denver this year. How soon are they looking to buy?" "Advance men will be in town next week," the sheriff replied. "They're talking about needing regular supplies for at least 2 years while they lay track through the territory." As the men discussed the business implications, Katherine found herself thinking about how this news would affect their family. The railroad meant progress, easier access to supplies, better prices for their cattle, maybe even a proper school for the children instead of the one-room schoolhouse that currently served the area. Later that evening, after the children were asleep and the house had settled into its nighttime quiet, a relative term in a home with 6 children, Katherine and Elijah sat on their porch swing, discussing the future. "The railroad contract would mean we could finally build that new barn you've been wanting," Elijah said, his arm around her shoulders. "And maybe send Edward to that school in Denver he's been reading about." Katherine nodded. "He's got a mind for engineering. Did you see the water pump system he designed for the garden? The boy needs proper training to develop his talents." "And what about you?" Elijah asked, turning to look at his wife. "Is there anything you want that we haven't been able to provide?" Katherine considered the question seriously. When she had married Elijah 7 years ago, their dreams had been modest, a comfortable home, enough food on the table, the children's well-being. Now, with the ranch prospering beyond their initial hopes, new possibilities were opening before them. "A piano teacher for Lucy," she said finally. "She has real talent, Elijah. Better than I ever had. With proper instruction, she could really make something of it." Elijah smiled.
"Done."
"Anything else?" Katherine leaned against his shoulder, content in the life they had built together. "Just this," she said softly. "Just our family, our home, the noise and chaos and love of it all. That's always been enough for me." The following spring brought the changes they had anticipated. The railroad construction began in earnest, bringing an influx of workers and business to Riverend. Elijah's contract to supply beef proved lucrative, allowing them to make the improvements they had discussed. Edward began corresponding with the engineering school in Denver, his excitement palpable as he received information about courses and requirements. Lucy's piano lessons with Mrs. Harrington, a former concert pianist who had followed her husband west, revealed a talent that surprised even Katherine, who had always believed in her stepdaughter's abilities. James continued to show a remarkable affinity for horses, spending every available moment in the stables with his father's growing herd. His dream, expressed with increasing frequency, was to breed and train the finest horses in Colorado Territory. "He's got a gift," Elijah told Katherine one evening as they watched their son calming a spirited new mare. "Reminds me of myself at that age." The younger children thrived as well. Grace, now 4, had developed a passion for stories, carrying books around the house and begging anyone who would listen to read to her. The twins, William and Elizabeth, were growing into distinct personalities, William quiet and observant, Elizabeth bold and determined. As the family gathered for dinner one summer evening, the usual cheerful chaos in full swing, a knock at the door interrupted their meal. Elijah rose to answer it, returning moments later with a weathered envelope in his hand and an odd expression on his face. "What is it?" Katherine asked, immediately concerned by his demeanor. Elijah cleared his throat. "It's from Sarah's brother, Michael. I haven't heard from him since before she died." The children fell silent, even James sensing the gravity of the moment. "He's in San Francisco," Elijah continued, scanning the letter. "Apparently, he's done well for himself in shipping." Elijah paused, his expression troubled. "He wants to meet the children. Says he's their only blood relative and regrets losing touch after Sarah's passing." Edward's face hardened slightly. "We haven't heard from him in 9 years, and now he wants to meet us?" Lucy placed a hand on her brother's arm. "He's our uncle, Edward. Maybe he didn't know how to reach us after we moved." "What does he want?" James asked, his usual exuberance subdued. Elijah exchanged a glance with Katherine before answering. "He says he's planning to travel east in September and would like to stop here for a visit. He also mentions—" Elijah hesitated again. "He mentions possibly providing for your education, Edward, if you're interested in university." An uncomfortable silence fell over the table. Katherine felt a knot forming in her stomach at the thought of this unknown relative appearing in their lives, potentially disrupting the family they had so carefully built. "You don't have to decide anything now," she said, looking at each of the older children in turn. "We can discuss it as a family once we've all had time to think." Edward nodded, his expression unreadable. Lucy looked thoughtful, while James simply pushed his food around his plate, no longer interested in eating. That night, after the younger children were asleep, Katherine found Edward sitting alone on the porch steps, staring up at the stars as he had so often done as a younger boy. "May I join you?" she asked softly. Edward nodded, making room for her on the step. They sat in companionable silence for several minutes before he spoke. "I don't remember Uncle Michael," he admitted. "I was too young when Mama died." "That's understandable," Katherine replied. "You were only 8. I do remember Mama, though," Edward continued, his voice thick with emotion. "Not as well as I'd like, but I remember her singing to Lucy and how she would brush my hair back from my forehead when I had a fever." Katherine remained silent, allowing him the space to process his thoughts. "I'm afraid," Edward finally confessed. "I'm afraid if I go away to school, whether with Uncle Michael's help or not, I'll forget even more about her. And I'm afraid of leaving here, leaving all of you. This is home." Katherine placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Edward, your mother will always be a part of you, no matter where you go. And this will always be your home, even if you travel to the ends of the earth." He turned to look at her, his eyes so like his father's, searching her face. "When Uncle Michael comes, he might not understand. About you, I mean. That you're our mother now, in every way that matters." Katherine felt tears prick her eyes at his words. "Then we'll help him understand. Family isn't just about blood, Edward. It's about love and choice and commitment. Your father and I chose each other, and I chose all of you. Nothing can change that." Edward nodded, seeming satisfied with her answer. "I'd still like to go to engineering school," he said after a moment. But not because Uncle Michael offers to pay. Because you and Pa believe in me. Katherine wrapped an arm around his shoulders, marveling at how this boy, nearly a man now, had grown in the years since a quiet widow and a noise-promising cowboy had found each other. "We've always believed in you," she said simply. "And we always will." September arrived with golden light and cooling temperatures. The Morgan household buzzed with anticipation as they prepared for Michael Blackwood's visit. Katherine had the guest room freshly painted and new curtains sewn. Lucy polished the silver and practiced her most impressive piano pieces. Even James made an effort to keep his usual exuberance in check, determined to make a good impression on his mysterious uncle. On the appointed day, Elijah drove the wagon into town to meet the afternoon stage from Denver. Katherine remained at home with the children, all dressed in their Sunday best despite it being a Thursday. "What if he doesn't like us?" James asked, voicing the concern that had been evident in all the children's behavior. "Then that would be his loss," Katherine replied firmly. "But I'm sure he'll adore you all, just as anyone with sense would." The sound of the wagon returning sent a ripple of tension through the house. Katherine straightened her dress and checked that the younger children were presentable before opening the door to greet their visitor. Michael Blackwood proved to be a tall, distinguished man with graying temples and the same blue eyes as Lucy. He stepped down from the wagon with the ease of someone accustomed to travel, his clothes speaking of wealth without ostentation. "Mrs. Morgan," he said, removing his hat as he approached. "Thank you for welcoming me into your home. Elijah has been telling me about the remarkable family you've built together." "Mr. Blackwood," Katherine replied with a polite nod. "We're pleased to have you. Please come inside and meet the children." The introductions went smoothly, each child responding with the manners Katherine had carefully instilled. Michael's eyes misted slightly as he looked at Edward, Lucy, and James. "You look so much like your mother," he told Lucy, his voice thick with emotion. "She would be so proud of the young lady you've become." Dinner that evening was a more formal affair than usual, with the children on their best behavior and conversation flowing more easily than Katherine had anticipated. Michael shared stories of his sister as a young woman, tales the children had never heard and clearly treasured. He spoke of his shipping business in San Francisco and his travels throughout the Pacific. "I've brought some gifts," he announced as the meal concluded. "Nothing extravagant, just tokens from my travels." From his trunk came silk scarves for Lucy and Katherine, carved wooden puzzles for the younger children, a set of quality drafting tools for Edward that made the boy's eyes widen with delight, and for James, a beautifully crafted saddle knife with a mother-of-pearl handle. For a young man developing his skills with horses, Michael explained as James turned the knife over in his hands with reverent care. Later, after the younger children had been put to bed and Lucy had impressed her uncle with her piano playing, the adults gathered in the parlor for coffee. Edward and James, granted special permission to stay up, sat quietly nearby. "I must say, Elijah," Michael began, "when I finally tracked you down after all these years, I wasn't sure what to expect. I certainly never imagined finding my sister's children part of such a thriving family." "Katherine deserves most of the credit," Elijah replied, his pride evident. "She took on 3 grieving children and gave them a mother's love when they needed it most." Michael turned to Katherine with genuine respect in his eyes. "And for that, Mrs. Morgan, you have my deepest gratitude." Sarah would be comforted knowing her children found such care. Katherine inclined her head, accepting the compliment. "They've given me far more than I've given them, Mr. Blackwood. This family saved me as much as I may have helped them." Michael nodded thoughtfully before addressing the matter that had clearly been on his mind. "Elijah mentioned that Edward has an interest in engineering. I'd like to discuss the possibility of sponsoring his education at a proper university, perhaps even back east, where the finest schools are located." Edward sat up straighter, his expression serious. "I'm grateful for the offer, Uncle Michael, but I've been corresponding with a Colorado School of Mines in Denver. Their program would allow me to learn what I need while remaining close enough to visit home regularly. Michael looked mildly surprised but nodded. A sensible choice. The Western Territories will need skilled engineers as they develop. I'd be pleased to help with the expenses, if your parents agree. We've been saving for Edward's education, Elijah said, but additional support would certainly make things easier. Consider it settled then. Michael turned to Lucy. And you, my dear, have remarkable talent at the piano. Have you considered formal training? Lucy glanced at Katherine before answering. Mama has arranged for me to study with Mrs. Harrington, who trained at a conservatory in Boston. She says I'm progressing well. Excellent, Michael replied with approval. Music brings such joy to a home. Your mother played beautifully as well, though not with your natural aptitude. The conversation continued, touching on James's gift with horses and the younger children's developing personalities. Throughout the evening, Katherine observed their visitor carefully, relieved to find him genuinely interested in the children's welfare rather than seeking to disrupt their family. Before retiring for the night, Michael took a moment to speak privately with Katherine on the porch, away from the others. I must confess, Mrs. Morgan, I came here with some trepidation, he admitted. I've carried guilt for not maintaining contact with my sister's children after her passing. I feared I might find them in difficult circumstances, or that they might resent my sudden appearance. Children are remarkably resilient and forgiving, Katherine replied. They've adapted to far greater changes than meeting a long-lost uncle. Michael nodded thoughtfully. I see that now, and I see how completely they view you as their mother. When James spoke of Mama earlier, I momentarily thought he meant Sarah, but of course, he has no memories of her. You are the only mother he's known. I've tried to keep Sarah's memory alive for them, Katherine assured him. We speak of her often, and the older children have a few keepsakes. I would never want to replace her in their hearts. You haven't replaced her, Michael said kindly. You've simply given them what she no longer could. There's a difference. Katherine felt a weight lift from her shoulders at his understanding. Thank you for saying that. It means a great deal. Michael stayed for a week, gradually relaxing into the rhythm of the Morgan household. He joined Elijah and the boys on their ranch work, read stories to Grace, and even managed to make the twins laugh with silly faces at breakfast. By the time he departed, promising to return the following year, he had been fully integrated into their extended family. Your brother-in-law is a good man, Katherine told Elijah as they watched Michael's stage depart. I'm glad the children will have that connection to their mother's family. Elijah wrapped an arm around her waist. I am too. And I'm even more glad that they have you, that we all have you. Our family wouldn't be complete without you, Katherine. As they walked back to their home, the house that had once been too quiet until a cowboy with children had promised to fill it with noise, Katherine reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From crushing loneliness to abundant love, from silence to joyful chaos, her life had transformed in ways she could never have imagined. That evening, as the familiar sounds of their family filled the house, Lucy practicing her piano, James recounting an adventure with his favorite horse, Edward explaining a mechanical concept to Grace, while the twins babbled in the background, Katherine caught Elijah's eye across the room and smiled. He returned her smile with one of his own, the same understanding passing between them that had been present from the beginning. This noise, this beautiful chaos, was the greatest blessing either of them could have wished for. And in the years that followed, as their children grew and the house eventually quieted again, Edward pursuing his engineering career, Lucy teaching music in the growing town, James establishing his own horse breeding operation nearby, and the younger children following their own paths, Katherine and Elijah would sometimes sit on their porch in the evening stillness, remembering the promise that had started it all. I'll fill it with noise, Elijah would quote with a chuckle, taking his wife's hand in his. The best promise anyone ever made, Katherine would reply, leaning against the shoulder of the man who had brought life and love back into her world when she needed it most. And though the house might grow quieter as they aged, it would never again know the desperate silence of loneliness, for they had built a family whose love would echo through its walls for generations to come.